Hello and welcome to Chapter 14, the genus Homo. There are many controversies surrounding the existing fossil record and how to interpret fossil remains. Every time we find new fossils, the fossil record gets reinterpreted as to which fossil species evolved into which fossil species evolved into which. Because when you go back into the mid 1900s, 1960s, 1970s, they kept finding new fossils with new species. So their view on which species evolved into which changed as they found new intermediary species. More fossils turn up with transitional features or in between dates of existence. It becomes more difficult to draw the lines between them. So at one point, scientists thought it was very easy. Australopithecus africanus evolves into Homo habilis, evolves into Homo erectus, evolves into the next thing. Nice straight lines. And then as I find transitional forms and differences and more fossils and different dates, it becomes more cloudy exactly which evolves to which. We don't have, it's not as clear cut anymore. Researchers also often have a bias on what theories they subscribe to, often related to which things that they have discovered. If you discover a new fossil, in terms of your ego and how you're viewed by the world and your scientific prowess, you'd prefer it to be a new species. Look, I've discovered a new species. It always makes you more important, and your name will be remembered better than, I found the 54th version, 54th fossil of a Homo erectus. So that makes a difference. It's also hard to get an accurate sense of the features present because of the fragmentary nature of fossils. So you have a fossil like this one, where this brown part represents the actual fossil pieces they found, and this lighter tan part is their reconstruction of the shape they thought it was. As you can see, you're missing a lot of the actual head, that they're just guessing what the shape of it was. So the zygomatic arch over here is missing entirely, so they've just made they had to guess what shape all this might be because it's missing. As early as 2015, it was felt that the roots of the genus Homo went back to approximately 2.4 million years ago. Then in 2015, they found a mandible in Ethiopia that possibly pushed the date back as far as 2.8 million years ago. So again, you have to look at what are the dates on the fossils that are being found. So if your theory is that Australopithecus africanus evolved into Homo habilis, but then if you start finding fossils of the two species that overlap in time that show that they were living in the same time period, then Africanus really would no longer be able to be considered an ancestor to habilis. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at. The earliest members of the genus Homo have been found predominantly in Eastern Africa. They're often referred to just as early Homo. Their features make them more like us in some ways, but in any case, they are distinct from Australopiths. So that's why they've been put into the genus Homo. There's several recognized species, and as they find new fossil discoveries, new questions arise. In 2013, they actually found a site in South Africa called Rising Star Cave with over 1,500 fossil bones representing many individuals of both sexes and of different ages. This is a record number of fossils for one species. The researchers who found it named it H. naledi because they felt that it was different enough from Homo habilis to be its own species. However, they've been unable to date this particular site for whatever reason, And so without having an accurate date, it's hard to place it into figure out where it fits in the line of human descent. So the earliest of the genus Homo that there's not nearly as much controversy of is Homo habilis. Homo habilis was discovered by Mary and Louis Leakey back in 1960. It dates from 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago. That means it overlaps with Australopithecus boisei or Paranthropus boisei, depending on which term you prefer to use. It was named Handyman because of its presumed association with stone tools. And I'll be right back so I can show you some stone tool samples. So this was the first specimen where they actually found stone tools. So at the time in 1960, it was felt that nothing earlier or older than Homo habilis would have stone tools because only the genus Homo had large enough brains to produce tools. We now know that tools can be found all the way back to Australopithecus afarensis. So they date back farther. But Homo habilis had tools. They're very simple tools where you can see most of the rock is still existent and they just chipped off one end to make more of a blade shape. But besides making stone tools, they had larger brains than Africanus. They still look very similar. So this is Africanus. And this is habilis. So you still have the brow ridge, you still have, I'm not used to working this on camera, you still have prognathism, so the face is still sticking out. You still have a lot of post-orbital constriction, but not quite as much. So you're starting to lose some of the post-orbital constriction that we saw in Africanus. They also still retain some ape-like features, such as the arms are longer relative to the legs than you see in modern humans. Another one that was found in 1972 by Richard Leakey, he named Homo rudolfensis, which is this guy. He felt that some of the specimens were different enough from Homo habilis for it to be considered a new species. But not everyone agrees. And part of the problem with that is that there are no postcranial remains for what's considered Homo rudolfensis. So they can't look to see whether everything else looks similar to each other and maybe there's differences in skulls shapes, just as there are differences in skull shapes with modern humans. There's variation in different modern humans. On page 384 of your book, there is a chart that compares the features of Africanus to Homo habilis. Homo habilis had a higher cranium. So if you look at how high this goes up compared to Africanus, you can see that this has a higher, a little more forehead and a higher, rounder skull. There was larger cranial capacities, so we've gone from around 600 cc's up to about 775 cc's. Less post-orbital constriction, and this is what we're going to see as we continue through the rest of our ancestry, is that as the brain gets bigger in order to make space for it, one of the things that happens is you lose that post-orbital constriction. So this area back here, up right behind the eyes, is going to get opened up more and more and more until you reach modern humans where we have virtually no post-orbital constriction to make room for the larger head. And the face is smaller relative to the cranium. Related to diet and chewing, the face is less prognathic than we've seen before, flatter, more orthogonic, with a smaller, thinner mandible. The mandible is more parabolic, so that's less V-shaped. So it's getting more of a U shape to it now. There's a shortened length of the posterior tooth row. So the reason that the face is getting flatter is because the molars and premolars are getting smaller, and that's allowing the face to become flatter because you don't need as much space for the teeth. And the teeth are becoming more human-shaped, and I don't have one with incisors in place to show you, but the Australopiths had very narrow, almost peg-like incisors, and as we get into Homo habilis, we start to see a broadening of those incisors until it's starting to get more like we have with the broad incisors, and the premolars and molars are getting smaller. So again, the tools are called Oldowan tools. This is in honor of where Homo habilis was discovered, which is the Olduvai Gorge in East Africa. They're very simple stone tools, very, just gonna take a chip off of, one or two chips off of each side. We can tell that they were being used because along with the tools, we also find fossils of animal bones that show cut marks and percussion marks. So they were used to butcher large animals for meat. That's what the cut marks end up from. And to crack open the bones, bang, 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 to get to the bone marrow, because bone marrow is a very good source of calories. Technological advances are going to accompany anatomical changes throughout the evolution of humans. So the stone tools found with Australopithecus afarensis are much more primitive even than these stone tools. And as we get moving through time, the stone tool culture is going to become more complex as the brains become bigger and we get these advances. We don't know for sure which population of early Homo evolved into the next one. We don't know if Rudolfensis and habilis are two separate species, then we don't know which one of them evolved into Homo erectus, which is our next one. So Homo erectus was originally called Pithecanthropus erectus, which means upright ape man. Back in the late 1800s, there was this, all the way up into the early 1900s, there was this feeling that there was a missing link between apes and humans. And so people would go out looking for the missing link. And that's why Piltdown Man was such a successful hoax, was because Piltdown Man represented the missing link that everybody had been looking for between apes and humans. So this gentleman named Dr. Dubois went searching for the missing link. And he looked in Indonesia on the island of Java, where he actually found it. And he named it Pithecanthropus erectus, upright ape man. Homo erectus dates from 1.9 million years ago all the way to 150,000 years ago. So it's a very long time range for these guys. They've been found in Indonesia, Africa, Western Asia, the country of Georgia, and East Asia, China and Indonesia. There's a lot of variation in between the fossils that are labeled as Homo erectus, as well as a long time range and a wide geographic distribution. So this has raised doubts as to whether they are indeed one species or multiple species that existed at the same time. Due to the biggest morphological differences are between those found in Africa and those found in Asia. So many researchers have split them into two species, Homo erectus in Asia and Homo ergaster in Africa. So this is Homo ergaster, and this is Homo erectus. And you can see there's a difference in the shape of the face, even though this one's broken up a lot. There's a difference in the shape of the face, and there's a difference in how their skulls, the roundness of their skulls, how much roundness there is back on the occipital region. So some researchers feel that this is enough to say that they're two separate species. But this scenario is in dispute, especially because a partial cranium was found in Ethiopia from around 1 million years ago that is more similar to the Asian form than the African form, even though it was found in Africa. So this may prove, as we find more fossils, that these are one species. There's just regional variation and personal variation between the shapes of the skulls. If it is decided through finding more fossils that Homo erectus and Homo ergaster are actually the same, that they're not two separate species, then the name will devolve back to Homo erectus, because in scientific nomenclature, the older name is always the name that is picked. If there's disagreement, if it's proven that later ones that were named differently are indeed that the same as the one that was done with the older name, they always go back to the older name. On pages 385 and 386, there is a chart that talks about the features that compare Homo habilis to Homo erectus and how they are different. So Homo erectus has thicker bone. Their skull, for some reason, has become longer and lower than we see in Homo habilis. And we'll see this a couple times through the evolution of the genus Homo, that sometimes we'll have the skull will be more up, and sometimes it will be longer and lower. And we're not completely sure why we see those differences. The cranial capacity of Homo erectus is larger than that of Homo habilis, 850 to 1100 cc's. There is what's called a sagittal keel. So remember, the sagittal line is the one that runs through this part of the skull. They don't have a sagittal crest, so you can't see it externally. But what happens is the sagittal line, the bone is thickened there. The keel is a thickening of the bone that occurs within the bone running along the sagittal suture. They have a large supraorbital torus. So the supraorbital torus is just another name for a brow ridge. So supra means above, orbital, the orbits. So it's this torus above the orbits. So they have a pretty pronounced brow ridge going on there. They have a shorter face. So the face is getting, again, more orthogonic than we saw with habilis. They have less postorbital constriction. They have, because their skull is long and low, they have a receding forehead. So the forehead does not go up. So Rudolfensis, you'll see the forehead goes up. And in Erectus, it goes more back. So it's more of a receding forehead. And the maximum breadth of the skull is near the bottom, near the base. So again, maximum breadth of the skull of modern humans is all the way, if you feel your head, all the way up on the parietal bone, all the way up here. This, you can see the maximum breadth is way down by the level of the ears. They have, for the first time in any of our humans, they have a projecting nasal region. So it's hard to tell with this one because it's got the brow ridge, but they start having the nose where there's actually a bridge to the nose that they did not have earlier. So earlier, Homo habilis and the Australopithecines would have had a nose more like a chimpanzee or a gorilla with no bridge and very, very, very flat to the face. Now they're starting to get more of a bridge to the nose. They have a vertical or receding mandibular symphysis. So we have a chin. We have our mental eminence where our chin sticks out. Theirs would not. It would have been straight up and down or receding backwards. They are taller at adulthood than Homo habilis. They have less sexual dimorphism than Homo habilis. And their postcranial bones are basically, their postcranial is basically the same as modern humans, except for they were more muscled and robust than modern humans. So Homo erectus is important for a number of different ways, number of different things. Anatomically, they're the first humans known to have a modern human-like body proportions. So their arms are shorter compared in relation to their legs, just like with modern humans. And this is a complete adaptation to bipedalism. This is not to say that Homo habilis was not completely bipedal, rather that over time between Homo habilis or whichever one, from the era of Homo habilis up to the era of Homo erectus, something occurred, a mutation occurred in the genome that coded for shorter arms. And because they were no longer dependent on trees, because they were bipedal, there was no downside to it. So it stayed in the genome because they were not needing to be arboreally adapted. So if something happened to make them less adapted to being in trees, it didn't matter because that's not where they were living. They were also taller than all their predecessors, within the range of modern humans for height. A recent find of some hand bones from 1.4 million years ago also shows the earliest evidence for a precision grip. So that's where you can hold things and do very fine things with the grip between your forefinger and your thumb. And this is again where you're looking at this last bone in your thumb. It's going to be broader at the tip with more space for small muscles to attachment. There's more muscle attachment spaces, and that allows for more manipulation of the tip of your thumb to do that precision grip. And that fits well with their behavioral advances, because behaviorally they're showing to be more flexible in their behavior, being able to survive outside of Africa and other, migrating out to other countries and being successful in other habitats and climates. It also shows that they, behaviorally, there's also with Homo erectus, the earliest evidence for hearths. So hearth is a controlled fire. It's a fire pit. So they had developed the ability to control fire. And what you get with controlling fire is a number of different things. You can cook your food. This lets your food, if you're eating meat, your food's softer, so you don't need as much, you don't need those big teeth to chew your food, even with fruits, and vegetables. Think about how hard a potato is before and after you cook it. So they could cook tubers in the fire and they'd become softer, so they didn't need to have big chewing surfaces and big molars and premolars to process their food anymore because they could cook it. Fire also provides warmth, so they could move out of Africa to cooler environments and still be able to stay warm enough. And fire provides protection from predators. So they could move into areas with new predators, but they still had protection, even though they didn't, when they first moved there, know who the predators were. And fire could possibly increase their social activity because they're sitting around the hearth, so they're being, more social. They're gathering around a hearth. They're interacting with each other more. That could have increased their social activities, their social behavior, and their social awareness. And their precision grip led them to produce finer tools. So Homo erectus tools are much better made than the Oldowan tools. So this is called the Acheulean tool culture. So this is again the Homo habilis tools. It's basically a rock with a couple of chips taken out, a couple of flakes. When we get to the Acheulean tools, we are producing bifacial hand axes. This is a stone that has been worked on both sides. The entire surface has been worked to bring it down to an edge all the way around. This is called a hand axe. It's found in Africa and Europe, but not in Asia, which is one of the reasons they give for why Ergaster and Erectus might be two different species, because in one case they're using tools, in one case they're not. Experiments by experimental archaeologists show that these were probably used on meat, bone, wood, as well as hides. So you're cutting the meat off of bones. You can chop bones up to make bone tools. You can use them to scrape meat and fat off of hides, things like that. So the broader set of tools and the ability to control fire almost certainly related to a greater reliance on animals' food resources. So they're moving away from a predominantly vegetarian diet like we saw in the Australopithecines into a diet richer in animal meat. They're eating more meat, they're getting fat. It's a diet that lends itself to more calories because you have the fat in the bone marrow and the fat on the animals themselves. And also, the broader set of tools help them to be able to explore and inhabit new regions, having better tools. In 1991, that's when they found the fossils in Georgia, in Western Asia. And these are called the Dmanisi, and they date from about 1.8 million years ago. I don't have an example of them, but they appear to have been part of a very early migration out of Africa towards the very beginning of the evolution of Homo erectus. So they have similar features to Homo erectus, but their cranial capacity is lower, closer to 550 to 750, as opposed to that 800 to 1100 cc's. And their associated tools were simpler, because as tool evolution goes along with increased cranial capacity. We don't know which one comes first, but obviously they didn't have as much cranial capacity, and their tools were simpler than the Acheulean. More complex than the Oldowan, but not as complex as the Acheulean. There is just some disagreement as to whether these are indeed early Homo erectus or a new species. Again, they need to find more of them in order to be able to tell. So that is our lecture for today, and then next week we will finish off chapter 14.